let's just pause to remind ourselves and the audience who have joined us about what Kemi Badenoch, the Minister for Equalities, said recently.
What we are against is the teaching of contested political ideas as if they are accepted facts. We don't do this with communism, we don't do this with socialism, we don't do it with capitalism. And I want to speak about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close to home to my life. And it is the promotion of critical race theory, an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. I want to be absolutely clear. This government stands unequivocally against critical race theory. Some schools have decided to openly support the anti-capitalist Black Lives Matter group, often fully aware that they have a statutory duty to be politically impartial. Black lives do matter, of course they do. But we know that the Black Lives Matter movement, capital BLM, is political. I know this because at the height of the protest, I saw white Black Lives, I've been told of white Black Lives Matter protesters calling, and I'm afraid I apologize for saying this word, calling a Black armed police officer guarding Downing Street endorse that movement on this side of the House. It is a political movement, and what would be nice would be for members on the opposite side to condemn many of the actions that we see this political movement instead of pretending that it is a completely wholesome anti-racist organization. There is a lot of pernicious stuff that is being pushed, and we stand against that. We do not want to see teachers teaching their white pupils about white privilege and inherited racial guilt. And let me be clear, any school which teaches these elements of critical race theory as fact, or which promotes partisan political views such as defunding the police without offering a balanced treatment of opposing views, is breaking the law.
Professor Vinilanda, an important reminder there for us and our audience. What is your response to the minister? Do you think she's right?
No, I don't, in a word. I don't think she's right. I cease to be shocked and surprised by proclamations like that, to be perfectly honest. And I'm not surprised to see a Black person speaking on the behalf of white power. It's a strategy that's been used throughout history, and no doubt it will happen again. And it's interesting how she has been positioned really to make that statement, and as Equalities Minister. So I'm not shocked by the statement, I'm not shocked by the tactics, but of course she's entirely misinformed about the nature of CRT, as tonight's discussion has shown. Maybe there is a feeling of being on the back foot, perhaps politically, if you think about the events of the summer in terms of the killing of George Floyd, in terms of the Black Lives Matter protests, and maybe there's some emulation of Trump's banning of teaching or using CRT in the training of state officials, if you like. And for me, I think coming in Black History Month from a Black woman, that didn't shock me either, because that was just, to me, appeared to be such a calculated move. And one of the things that I would say is that in these sessions I have done with schools, they've been enlightened by CRT. None of them have said, oh yes, we actually teach CRT. I don't know of a school that teaches CRT, to be perfectly honest with you. And you know, I've been working in education for a pretty long time. And I know that teachers, some teachers don't know what CRT is unless they're perhaps studying for a doctorate or a higher level degree. I think the minister wasn't well informed, and I think her notion, her supposition that CRT is an ideology is completely inaccurate and wrong. CRT, as I said earlier, and if people have said subsequently in this debate, is that it's based on theory. It's based on evidence. It's based on empirical evidence that legal scholars in the US gathered and analysed to look at the convictions and how the law was not best serving the interests of the Black community, and particularly Black men, in terms of how many of them were incarcerated. So to call it a political ideology is just completely wrong. I would argue that it's political ideology that maintains that our curriculum is white. It's political ideology and systemic racism that maintains a teaching workforce that is predominantly white. You know, if just picking up on Christine's point there, and I will come back to the question in a moment, looking at the figures published by UCAS, released by UCAS, on the recruitment of Black men into teaching, there has been just a steady flatlining in terms of the number of Black men applying to come into teaching and the number of Black men that are actually accepted. So last year in 2019, there were 825 applications from Black men to come into teaching, of which only 285 were accepted. And if you compare that to the recruitment of white men, it's shocking to look at that figure. So of the 10,440 applications from white men, 6,875 were accepted in 2019, and that's a success rate of 65% compared to the success rate of 34% for Black males. What I'd like to know is what the government is doing to diversify the teaching workforce, because in our schools, our classrooms are almost a third in terms of having BAME pupils in them. So, you know, to say that CRT is an ideology is completely wrong. To say that it peddles, I think she said, Black victimhood, is absolutely rubbish, because I think for me, it's an empowering framework, because as all the speakers have said, it actually exposes the layers and levels at which racism works. You know, why is it, as Dave just said, why is it that Black women in this country, and I've used this same statistic, this same fact, when I've been doing my talks to postgraduate medical educators, why is it that Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth? Why is it that Black medical consultants are paid less, 7% less than their white counterparts and their doctors? So that's what really should be scrutinized, rather than CRT. So for me, I think the minister is wrong. She's misguided. She is herself informed by her own political ideology, and I think for me, CRT is. She also talked about white privilege, but we've all talked about how we've got to look at the historical origins of racism and how it became, how it's really the basis of our society, isn't it? It's the basis of how our society operates. But to actually take that away and just see CRT as an ideology is to mislead others, really, who are probably not as well informed as us. But CRT, for me, is more than just teaching children about racism. It's about getting youngsters to understand how racism has historical links, how racism underpins our global economy, how racism underpins capitalism, and I could go on. But I think I cease to be shocked by what politicians say anymore, and what we should be looking to do is to educate in an anti-racist way, so that our future generations understand the operations of power and how that power operates to sustain racism, to sustain the discourse of whiteness that perpetuates systemic racism in our society, so that Black women are, actually are more likely to die in childbirth. Sorry, I'm getting really irate now and passionate. That Black women are more likely to die in childbirth than white women. That's what not examining the historical legacy of racism and understanding how systemic racism works. That's the legacy that we have to deal with in a modern society in the 21st century.
Thank you, Vinny. Thank you very much. Again, lots to think about. I'm just gonna pull this back a little bit. You say the minister isn't right, but schools do have a responsibility to maintain political neutrality. I see a lot of people in the chat are saying that there were some slides posted that teachers are in fact teaching critical race theory and perhaps not doing a good job of it. But we can't really make any judgment on that. But schools have a responsibility to maintain political neutrality. In fact, the 1996 Education Act states that governors and head teachers have a duty to ensure balanced treatment of political ideas. And of course, even the teaching standards argue that teachers need to uphold public trust in the profession and maintain high standards of ethics and behavior within and outside of school by ensuring that their personal beliefs are not expressed in ways which exploit young people's vulnerability or which might lead them to break the law. Charlotte Chatterton, again, I ask, might the minister be right? And I think it's really important that we put this out there because we have to debate this issue in a balanced way.
Thanks, Paul. I agree with everything that Vinny has just said. The issue here, I think, is that CRT is a structural understanding of racism. So this challenges more common understandings of life outcomes as individual responsibility rather than the result of structural social structures and wider influences. And that's classic neoliberalism. And this point of view blames the individual for any disadvantage or failing and lets the government off the hook in terms of responsibility. Neutrality isn't possible. There's no such thing as neutrality. We are all positioned in society. So I think I'd like to also pick up on this idea, which we talked about earlier, which Dave talked about, in terms of the idea of CRT being divisive, that I think the minister suggested. But this is based on the notion that the white male experience is universal. Otherwise, it couldn't be seen as divisive. But the CRT response to that is that experiences are different, and experiences are shaped by race and gender and class and sexuality and the way in which we are positioned by others. There's also a misunderstanding or perhaps a misrepresentation of what white privilege means in what the minister says, in terms of this idea. I think is often misunderstood, white privilege, as perhaps as white people being socioeconomically privileged, whereas in fact CRT focuses on racial privilege or disadvantage. And also, if an individual isn't aware of their own privilege or disadvantage, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'd also like to pick up on the idea of CRT positioning Black minority ethnic people as victims in some way, or perhaps having little agency to change their situation. Whereas in fact, I think we need to come back to this idea of CRT focusing on structures within which we act and which shape all our experiences. And they also create, these structures don't just create disadvantage, they create privilege. And in that way, we are all structurally located and structurally positioned. And no one is a victim of that as such. It is simply the way in which society works. And anyway, as I argued earlier, CRT is an activist framework which aims to eradicate inequality, and it aims to help us understand why racial inequality persists.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. That's very helpful. And on that issue of the activist framework, let's just think about this through the curriculum lens. We didn't hear the full debate on that video, but I'm going to refer to conversation between MP Dawn Butler and Kemi Badenoch. So Dawn Butler says, we want all kids, all our children, black and white, in every single corner of this country to better understand our history, so our children have a true sense of belonging within British culture. To which Kemi Badenoch replied, we should not apologize for the fact that British children primarily study the history of these islands. And it goes without saying that the recent fad to decolonize maths, to decolonize engineering, to decolonize the sciences that we have seen across our universities to make race the defining principle of what it is to be studied is just misguided and also actively opposed to the fundamental purpose of education. Christine Calendar, your thoughts, activism.
Wow, where do I start? I think because what the minister then went on to say was that the curriculum by its very nature is limited. And I think that's a very important point for us to think about. The curriculum is only limited if you want it to be so. The curriculum is as broad or as narrow as we choose to make it. And I certainly was part of a conversation recently where it was suggested that in order to bring in Black history or other histories, it might mean necessitating taking something out. So I think actually the thinking around the curriculum needs some attention, because it is not a simple, well, if this comes in, that goes out. It's not about that at all. It's about having a more honest, accurate account that takes on board the experiences of everybody in this society, and not just come from the purview of the white elite. It is about teaching all of our histories, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent, so that young people can see the connections between the past and the future and understand the present that they're living in now, and have the ability and the skills to be able to evaluate that and unpick it and question it and disrupt it. That activism is really important. Otherwise, what is education for? Is it just to provide a body of knowledge that you just have to learn and that is it? Or is the curriculum something that is presented to us that we can question, that we can analyze, that we can evaluate, and that we can truly learn from?
That's helpful, Christine. Thank you. I'm going to stay with that theme a little bit, because there's a lot of enthusiasm around decolonizing the curriculum, a lot of enthusiasm around anti-racism. Paul Warmington, a Guardian investigation 5 months ago in June this year found that only 28 out of 128 universities were actually doing something to decolonize the curriculum. And we know that many schools up and down the country are taking this work on seriously. What would you tell schools and universities who might have been spooked by the statements of the minister?
I think there are a couple of things that I would like to say. One is, we've made this point repeatedly, that there's nothing new about critical race theory. Critical race theory has existed for 30 odd years. And moreover, there are ideas in critical race theory that go back a century, to the work of W.E. Du Bois and so forth. And as I said earlier on, one of the things that we're encouraged to do in our society is to have a kind of amnesia around issues of race and racism. In 1985, we had the Swan Report, which was a response to the uprisings that had happened around the country. Again, it's interest convergence. There were uprisings of Black youth around the country in the early 80s. In 85, the Swan Report is produced. And one of the things that Swan said was that one of the priorities for education should be anti-racist education, in particular in schools that were majority white. And the Swan Report wasn't a particularly radical piece of work. It had been watered down from its original incarnation, which was the Rampton Report. I think I've gotten the right way around. But anyway, Swan said what we need is anti-racist teaching across the board, and particularly in schools and in areas that are mostly white. And if in 1985 that was recognised under a conservative government, then it just beggars belief that there is this current frenzy around the presence of critical race theory. So again, historical ignorance on the part of Kemi Badenoch and her cohorts, historical ignorance about education in this country and about her own party's past reports. But the second thing I want to say is in some ways I'm kind of reticent to talk too much about this because there's an article I wrote recently called Critical Race Theory in England, and it says at the end of the article that trying to respond to many of the current critiques about critical race theory is a bit like trying to respond to Islamophobia as if it were a theological debate. What we're having here is not a debate about the content of critical race theory, because clearly the people who were sitting there behind Kemi Badenoch cheering her on are utterly ignorant of critical race theory. I mean, there were so many moments of farce and dark comedy in that piece of film. So when Kemi Badenoch said that she was against the government, was against critical race theory, the government's against critical race theory. It's against an intellectual tradition. What else is it against? Cubism, Hegelianism. And then she says this, and there's this cheering from behind her. Are we seriously to believe that the 50 MPs who are sitting behind her or whatever, have they read Derek Bell? Have they read Eduardo Bonilla Silva? Have they read Kimberly Crenshaw? So on what basis did they cheer? No, what we're looking at here is essentially a culture war. And it's a culture war precisely because for most of the last 40 years, your right-wing neoliberalism has dominated our politics in the West. Okay, and therefore our right-wing neoliberals are actually pretty stumped when it comes to playing out their own sense of victimhood, because neoliberalism and right-wing politics have always been based on a kind of victimhood. And our governments have been neoliberal. They have been largely centre-right or right-wing, and therefore all our government has to play with now is the idea that there are suspicious areas of we know that Westminster is conservative and has been for the last decade. So it must be schools, it must be universities that are actually oppressing us with their awful liberal critical race theory views. And it's also worth bearing in mind that this is very, very much an orchestrated, manufactured piece of outrage. Kemi Badenoch's speech was trailed. Yeah, if you look at The Economist in October, there was an article in The Economist that talked about dangerous trends in anti-racism in higher education. And they were clearly talking about critical race theory. Okay. And very often The Economist is the kind of, and there are good things about The Economist as well. The Economist very often sets the tone with things that government ministers end up talking about a few months later. So Kerry Badenoch's speech didn't come out of nowhere. And what we have to remember is that when we hear these conversations about critical race theory, they are not intended for us. They are not intended for school teachers. They are not intended for pupils. What they are about is a government speaking to its audience. And they know its audience of conservative supporters. They know its audience have not read critical race theory. They know its audience doesn't actually understand what critical race theory is. That's not important. The important thing is to set up a bogeyman. At the moment, our right-wing politicians cannot come out and actually, by and large, advocate racism. But what they can do is create a position that you might call anti-racism. And that's where we are. And finally, the other important thing to remember is that we've been here before. Again, if you're old enough to remember the 1980s, we had extreme culture wars in this country where you constantly had the press and governments attacking loony left local authorities and attacking LGBT people, attacking Peter Tatchell, attacking young black men as muggers and drug dealers. And I was talking with a few of my colleagues recently. And one of them said, this is our Section 28. Critical race theory is our Section 28. In the 1980s, the government passed a Local Authority Act that supposedly was meant to prevent teachers promoting LGBT lifestyles amongst their pupils. And the current attack on critical race theory is, I would say, largely our version of Section 28. And like Section 28, it's going to be largely unenforceable. Section 28 died away because it was unenforceable. And also the fact that we're into a repetition of the 80s of Section 28 also kind of underlines the exhaustion amongst the political right in this country. They're kind of reduced to being an exhausted tribute act on the one hand to Trump, on the one hand to 1980s Thatcherism. But these kind of culture wars, they will go on because it's one of the few spaces that that this government has to play with. But what critical race theorists and anti-racists of all kinds need to be clear about is that we cannot stand by and allow Black and brown communities, to allow children in our schools, and to allow anti-racism itself to become a useful tool for these culture wars. So I would say, as a critical race theorist, I'm actually standing up against the ideological encroachment on our schools of this what I would call a dangerous trend called anti-racism. Any right-thinking, moderate Briton has to stand up now against anti-racism, and I think critical race theorists are at the forefront of this a resistance to this appalling ideological trend. Anti-racism is what it is.
Thank you very much, Paul. Professor David Gilburn, anti-racism. That's really interesting. But David, there are many head teachers listening in on the call who are quite concerned. And what can you say as a critical race theorist to reassure them that they shouldn't be spooked by what the minister has said, but actually they need to keep up their activism, because actually CRT is an activist framework. What can you say to them to reassure them? Because I think that's really, really important.
I think I can only say that if they do a little bit of research, they'll find out that CRT is not only something which they shouldn't be afraid of, it can be a tool that they can use. It offers lots of insights into ways of resisting racism, which can be successful at a school and at a classroom level. I think, though, what's really frightening at the moment is the concerted nature of what Paul's saying, this anti-racism, because another way of saying anti-racism is pro-racism, and that's what this is. This is to apologize for racism, to legitimize racism, and to embolden racists. Because what this kind of talk does is it has two sides. One side is to scare anti-racists, that whenever they raise an issue, they will be told that they're not being politically neutral, because obviously when you attack racism, you're being ideological. When you defend it, you're being neutral in the government's terms. So it's to close down anti-racist work in schools and universities. It's to frighten people, and it's to embolden those who would tell us that we're just rocking the boat, we're causing disunity and sowing division. And I think, you know, you can see this growing over the last 10 years. The constant annual headlines about the failure of the white working class, how that's been manufactured through the knowing misinterpretation and manipulation of statistics, so that all sides of the media are telling the majority of white people that their children are suffering because too much attention is being paid to other people's children. That's not accidental. That's not innocent. It's been pointed out, these errors, year after year, and they are still doing the same work because it serves their interests to do that work. And it emboldens racists, and it closes down legitimate anti-racist work. So, you know, when people talk about a culture war, it sometimes sounds like something that simply happens on Twitter. This is a war that's being fought out on the streets and in the classrooms. And we need to recognize that this is a dangerous place. Those of us that are involved in this, you know, we get death threats. We have stuff daubed on our doors at work. We're not unfamiliar with how high the stakes are. So, you know, CRT can be a tool for helping us not just to get through this, but to actually take it forward and to win victories. But I think we shouldn't misunderstand what's happening. This is a concerted campaign being waged in defense of racism. And, you know, Kemi Badenoch was actually echoing the words of Catherine Birbalsingh, Claire Fox, Calvin Robinson, all these folks that are actually writing her script are promoting it through think tanks. They're promoting it through their own Twitter accounts. And, you know, they're placed in the House of Lords and in official commissions to examine race disparity. So this is not a kind of university debate. This is a real war about racism. And I think, uncomfortable though it might be, all teachers in schools, in universities, we need to decide what side we're on. Because if you don't choose a side, you are captured by the machine. As we said earlier, this machine produces racist outcomes. And unless you're being actively anti-racist, you will be carried along that conveyor belt of business as usual racism. So unless you decide to do something about it, you are siding with the racism which saturates this system.
Thank you so very much, Professor David Gilborn. Colleagues, there's just so many questions and comments coming through in the chat, but we have only 2 minutes to go. So I'm going to ask, you know, each of the panelists to just share their final reflections. Education is the seed and flower of development. And we discussed this evening, education, what CRT got to do with it. 30 seconds, colleagues. Paul Warmington, let's start with you.
Apologies, sorry. The last thing that Dave said was again the idea important to critical race theory that if you're not actively opposing racism, then you're carried along by its machine. And again, this is why critical race theory is dangerous for our government, but it's also why it is so positive in education. because what critical race theory does is it closes off that kind of supposedly neutral space. It closes off that sitting on the fence space. And it says, are you going to resist racism? Are you going to do something about it? Or are you going to do nothing? And that closing off of the sitting on the fence space, again, is what threatens a lot of thinkers in particular parts of our public debate.
Thank you very much. Charlotte Chatterton.
If we dismiss the tools that we need to analyse and understand race inequality, then we risk not understanding why race inequality persists. We risk blaming the disadvantaged for their own disadvantage, and we won't get the solution right. Critical race theory offers us the opportunity to understand racial inequality better.
Fantastic, fantastic. Professor Vinny Landa.
Thanks, Paul. So I just want to say that we need to be intolerant of the machine that is being that perpetuates racism, and that education is actually an act of liberation and not of subjugation, and that CRT is all about liberating and getting people, whether they're our students at university or whether they're students in school or whether they're teachers, to think differently. And as CRT critiques neutrality, there's no such place as neutrality, and to maintain that fallacy doesn't hold true to the act of teaching and disseminating education.
Thank you very much.
Students.
Christine Calendar, what are your final words?
Well, one of the government's mantras is that we have to prepare our young people to live in a modern British society. Well, that modern British society is imbued with racism and has been imbued with racism throughout its history. So for me, CRT is absolutely necessary for our young people to understand the society in which they're growing up in and the one which we're going to hand over to them.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our global audience today for joining us to debate this important topic. There are just so many comments in the chat. Thanks to our panelists, Dr. Christine Calendar, Associate Professor, Professor Vinny Landa, Professor David Gilbourne, Professor Charlotte Chatterton, Professor Paul Warmington, and I am Paul Miller. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.